Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the Entra Cloud Sync group writeback capability. Now we're used to the idea in our Entra world. We have our Entra ID tenant, and then we have all of our various identities. These could be users, service principals for applications, devices, whatever that might be. But for now, I'll focus on the user scenario. So I have users, and our best practice is we don't grant access directly to the users, we use groups. So I create my various types of group. My users get put into those groups, and then to those groups we can grant various things. I could grant roles. There might be various types of permissions I'm assigning. I might be giving access to various applications. I might be assigning licenses. But I'm doing it all via that group membership. And one of the nice things we can do is then build governance on top of that. Hey, I can apply things like access reviews to confirm, well, should you still be part of this group? And more commonly, what we're using now is entitlement management. So what I can do here is I have some access package which contains various things, including group membership. So now, as a user, I would go and request the access package. I would get placed into that group. But the nice thing here is with the access packages, we have things like, hey, I can have reviewers. I could have auto approval depending on where I'm coming from. I have time limitations for this. So, hey, I get it for 90 days and I have to go and reapply for it. So it's going to stop me having these stale memberships of the groups and therefore stale sets of permissions and roles and access to applications and licenses and all of those things. So this is fantastic for this great Entra world. I get all these fantastic capabilities. But what we have in most organizations still is I have my Active Directory domain services, which, remember, from many of my users is actually the source of truth. So the users are here, and my Active Directory domain services, we just call it AD, this is my source of authority. This is generally synchronizing this way, and these users I drew up here, well, more commonly, they've been synchronized, so they're actually replicated from on-premises and placed into there. But in my Active Directory world, I still have that same idea that I have AD trusting resources. And so how do I give access to that? Well, hey, I have this certain resource that trusts my Active Directory. And so once again, what I want is groups. So my users get placed into the group, and the group is granted access to the various types of resource I have that trust that Active Directory domain services. But I don't have any of these capabilities in Entra to help govern and track these Active Directory-based groups. Now, once again, I want to stress the point that when I think of the relationship between Active Directory domain services and Entra, this is the source of authority. The replication historically always flows this way. So I can synchronize my users, my groups, my devices, and they will show up in Entra. And we have various different types of sync technology to facilitate that. But we're performing that sync. And historically, we had the Entra Connect, where the provisioning engine runs in operating system instances on premises. But we also now have the Entra Cloud Sync, where that synchronization engine runs up in the cloud, and they just have these basic provisioning agents deployed in various places. But we're flowing that away. It's from AD into Entra. Well, with that flow of that direction, how can I manage my groups up here, but take advantage of them in my Active Directory? And as you would expect, that's this new Cloud Sync group writeback capability. So what we're now going to be able to do is with this Entra Cloud Sync group writeback, I'm going to be able to have groups and their memberships replicate back to on-premises. And this is really a step towards the idea of being cloud first, for that cloud transformation, this time as part of the identity. I think the long-term goal is to try and remove as many as those on-prem identity dependencies as we have. And the focus here is around the governance. What I want to be able to do is take advantage of the governance capabilities that we have in Entra, but apply it where I have those AD sets of trusting resources. So I'm thinking about, hey, as people get onboarded, they get given access into various groups that, hey, in Entra have various permissions and roles and apps, but also on-premises groups have access to various resources. But now I want to be able to use one single governance solution so that, hey, entitlement management, as I get added into groups, well, now I get permissions, yes, to Entra trusting resources and apps, but also AD trusting resources and apps. Because what we're going to do is we're going to synchronize these groups back into Active Directory along with their memberships. So that's the key goal around this. And very simply, it's going to do exactly this. So if we think what this new solution is going to facilitate, what now we're going to have is now it's using Entra Cloud Sync. So I have to have Entra Cloud Sync. And also it's using that provisioning agent which is the same agent we use for things like the API-based provisioning, the HR provisionings. And what's going to happen here is we're using this group writeback functionality, and the groups we specify will actually go and create the group in AD and maintain the members. So now that's going to go and create. So it can't be an existing group in Active Directory. The way this is going to happen is it has to be a cloud security group. I say, hey, I want to write this back. It will then go and create the group in Active Directory and then add in the users. Now, if we think about what that means, what I just said, it's going to create the group in Active Directory, so it can't already exist. Then it's going to add the users into that. It cannot create the users in AD. So what that means is the members of this group, if I want them to be populated in the Active Directory, they must have been synchronized users. So the users must exist in AD. Those users were synchronized into Entra. So now they're available in Entra. They can now be given membership into the group. It could be a assigned group where I manually assign them. It could be dynamic based on rules. They can be granted via access packages. The users just have to have been synchronized for AD so that when this group writeback functionality goes and creates the group, well, those users have to exist. There has to be an equivalent object so that it can go and add them into the group it's going to create in Active Directory and then add and remove as the membership changes up here. So the point is the source of authority just for this group writeback now becomes Entra, but the source of authority for the users is still Active Directory. So they have to be synced, but now they can go and be added when I perform that synchronization. If I have a cloud user that is a member, they're just going to be skipped. There's nothing it can do. And you'll see it in the logs. It will say, hey, this object was skipped because basically it doesn't exist in Active Directory. So there's nothing it can do about that. But what this now lets me do is, hey, I maintain the groups in Entra and using the Entra sets of functionalities, But now the group and its members will be available in Active Directory, so I can grant them access to the various resources, which now become part of one single governance solution. And this group writeback will replace the group writeback v2 functionality that's been in beta for a long time. That's going away. This will completely replace that. And so this is powered by Entra Cloud Sync. So I have to have Entra Cloud Sync and the provisioning agent deployed. That's a step one. It doesn't mean that I only can use Cloud Sync to synchronize the objects into Entra. As we'll see in my environment, I'm actually using Entra Connect for most of my objects. So it works side by side. So I can have Entra Connect and or Entra Cloud Sync for performing the synchronization from AD to Entra. It doesn't care. Likewise, even if Entra Cloud Sync is only replicating, let's say, from specific OUs from your Active Directory, where it writes these groups back to can be outside of that scoping. So in my environment, for example, I only replicate one OU using Cloud Sync, but I can actually create groups in any OU or container in the entire Active Directory environment. It might actually be nice to see that. So if we jump over for a second, just to demonstrate the idea around that. So if I was to go and look at my Entra Connect, and if we look at my regular Cloud Sync, and so we're focusing on the direction from AD to Entra, this is what we're used to. If we look at the scoping of what I'm doing in my environment, I'm only scoping from one OU, Cloudy, was my test. Everything else synchronizes with the regular Entra Connect. But as we're going to see in the demonstration, my group writeback actually writes to a completely different OU, Cloud Groups. And there we can see the way it created that group name. And so don't worry if you're like, hey, I'm using Entra Connect, that means I'm not going to be able to use this, or I'm only using very small set of OUs. Doesn't matter at all. I still can fully leverage this writeback to any OU I want to in my environment. And that's really the key thing that this does. It's not super complicated. It's, hey, I'm now going to be able to specify certain groups that I want to write back, providing the members of that group were synced from AD, they're going to show up in that group. So what does this actually look like in the environment? So let's walk through the complete process. So if we go back to our browser, you already saw me start to do this, but I'm in my Entra Connect. So I've gone in my hybrid management. I'm looking at my Microsoft Entra Connect. And then I'm going to my Cloud Sync area. Now, once again, I do have the regular Entra Connect running, which is doing most of my objects, and that's all healthy and good. But we're going to go to Cloud Sync. I've already deployed my agent, so I've got a provisioning agent running. We're going to do a new configuration. And this time what we see is this option of Microsoft Entra ID to AD synchronization. And at time of recording, it is in preview. So we're going to go ahead and create one of those configurations. Now, I've done it already. All it would do here would show me a list of domains that I have not yet configured Entra to AD for. I would select it, and then I would just hit create down the bottom. Now, I've done that already. So if I go and look at mine, so I'm going to select my Entra ID to AD configuration. The first thing it will ask you to do is to configure the scoping filter. Now here you have a choice. I could select all security groups or do selected security groups. Now I've done selected security groups, and then I select the particular group I want to synchronize. So if I do my edit objects, here it will show me all of the groups that are options for the synchronization. And notice some of them are grayed out. So what's the requirement for the groups? Now the key point here is it has to be a cloud-created group. So it cannot be a synced group. It has to be a cloud-created group, which is why you saw those ones grayed out where it said, hey, this was synchronized, this is not an option. And it has to be a security group. And it has to not be mail enabled. So it has to be a cloud security group. Let's write that in. So our valid options for this is it must be a cloud. So it was created in the cloud. It was not synced. Security. There's other types of group. It has to be a security group. And not today mail enabled. So that's our requirement for using the functionality. So if I was to go and look at my groups over here, you can see it's got a list of different groups available. And all of these, if we actually jumped over and looked at my groups, if you're not sure, and again, it can be assigned or it could actually be dynamic. It doesn't matter. But this group type has to be security, cannot be distribution. And the source has to be cloud. I created it in the cloud. That is your requirement. And it does not have an email address. I have not mail enabled it. So if I jump back over again, I could add, and in fact, just to play around, we'll add a new group. We can kind of see that work in the background. We'll add fastest people as well. Now, even if I was to select all security groups or even selected, I can now say, well, which container do I want it to go to? So I still have target container. Now I've configured it to a particular OU, but I could change that. I'm using a constant today. It's the same OU for everything, or container if it was users, for example. I could change it to direct. Direct would now use an attribute from the group where I would actually have, hey, this is the distinguished name of where I want it to go to in AD. Or I could write an expression. Expression would let me use logic and take values from the attributes to make a decision on which OU I want to go to. So I have a lot of flexibility if I don't want to all write to the same place. And the documentation actually has a nice example, if we scroll down, where they show me one of those expressions. So this is an example. They're doing a switch statement. So based on, hey, the display name, the object, it can either write here as the default, or if it's marketing, it can write to this OU. If it's sales, it would write to this OU. So it's got a default value, but then if the display name was marketing, it writes to OU marketing. If the display name was sales, it writes to sales. So I can use expressions for that mapping if I wanted to. So that's how I could control the OU it's going to write it to, or container, again, it could be a CN equals if it was like users, for example. And even then, it's showing me the groups, the ones I've selected, but I could still apply an attribute scope filter. So this would let me say, well, actually, I want to apply additional controls over which groups will actually get included. So I could add a scope filter, and I could block certain groups. So hey, I could select various attributes. Don't use extension attributes. They're shown, but they don't work. But I could select any of these attributes and operators and check for values for it to be in scope. So it would have to match this to then be part of the synchronization back to AD. But I'm going to leave that as is. So all I've done is I've added a new group. Fantastic. And you can even change the attribute mappings for what's going to get created in Active Directory. So here we've got the CN, the description, the display name, and the parent distinguished name. So that's just set in that value I set as a constant. You'll notice the name of the object, if I edit, it's taking the display name, but then it's adding to it basically the last 12 characters of the object ID. So that's why my name looked a little bit strange. because it's not just the name, the display name of the group, it's adding the last 12 characters of the object ID as well. If you start messing around with these and you break them, well, that's what restore default mappings is for. But you could add additional attributes. Again, don't use the extension attributes. There's no need to do that. So you would walk through all of those steps. Again, there's not a lot to it. And then you would click Enable Configuration. Now, mine's already enabled, but there would be an Enable Configuration here, and you would be done. And at that point, you should see things start to happen. Now, there's a few minutes delay, but what you would see is you would see in the provisioning logs, it would start to do the various things with what's happening in your environment. And again, this is a few minutes behind, so I'm not seeing that one I've just added yet. But a good example here is it's showing me, hey, I could see that original group, it went and created the Justice League, and then it updated it. You notice there's Dick Grayson keeps getting skipped over here, and I'll explain why in a second. But it gives me the detail of everything it's actually doing. So in this first instance, you saw it create the Justice League group on premises, and it showed me, hey, there's that slightly strange name because it's adding the last 12 of the object ID. And then once it created it, so the modified properties is all the different properties of the group. And then once it creates it, it had to update it. And what it's modifying now was the members. It added in the users, and we can see there's basically 4 values there. Now, if I was to look at that group in Entra, well, there's a few things. Firstly, it's a dynamic group, so it's just based off of rules and the job title of the person, but I have 5 people. If I look at the group that it created, so there's my group, open it up with excitement, there's 4 people. Well, the reason there's 4 people is that one of the users, and I did that deliberately to demonstrate, Dick Grayson, is a cloud user. They are not synchronized from Active Directory. So what that means is because they're not synchronized, they have no object in Active Directory that can be used. So Dick Grayson here, notice it says on-premise synced, no. So that user got synced, and we saw that in the provisioning logs. So when we looked at those provisioning logs and we kept seeing Dick Grayson is being skipped because the object just doesn't exist. The object does not exist within Active Directory, so there is no way to add them. And that's it. I mean, this is the process that's going on behind the scenes. It's a really powerful thing. Now, I already walked through kind of those key rules for you. So again, the key rules would be, has to be a cloud security group. It's not mail enabled. I cannot change the source of authority. So what I cannot do today is, hey, it's an AD group that's synchronized to Entra, but now I want to manage it through Entra and synchronize it back. I cannot do that today. How often does it replicate? The first time I enable this, it's going to replicate almost straight away, and it will do a full synchronization. So it's going to go through all of the objects in Entra, work out which apply, and update the membership. After that initial sync, it does a delta sync roughly every 20 minutes, but that could change. That's just what we've seen today. But it looks at the last watermark of where it last checked the updates. Anything since then, hey, what's changed? Do those apply? And it will update the membership. But if I change the configuration, if I change the scoping option, right, from all groups to selected groups, or change the selected groups, if I change the attribute mapping, if I change the scope filters, if I change the OU or the target, it will do a full sync again. So all of those things would trigger a full synchronization. Now, a huge warning. This is now the source of authority, but it's still a group in Active Directory. An administrator could absolutely go in and remove people or add people. Do not do that. There is no reconciliation today. Remember, this group is not synchronizing that way. It's always there's one source of authority, and it synchronizes from the source of authority to the other party. So it's either the source of authority is AD, which is all of the users and the regular stuff, so it's synchronizing into Entra, so Entra knows whatever changes here. But for this group writeback, we're setting those particular groups to have Entra as the source of authority. So the changes happen here, and the replication flows this way. So AD basically gets the changes that happen in Entra. But if I change something here, there is no flow of replication that way. It will not know, and they'll get out of sync. So treat this as do not mess with. All of the changes should go through here. Now, some types of change may get rectified if it does a full sync again. And also, I can do a provisioning on demand. So if I was to go back over to my overview here, so there's various things I'm replicating. But if I do provision on demand, what this does let me do is for up to 5 users, it's only 5. But if I selected my Justice League group, now what it's showing me here is view members only. So only show me the members of the group. And I could select up to 5. Or maybe what's happened is there's a user that shouldn't be in the group. They were removed from the group. So I could say view all users, which would then let me select maybe someone who's not in the group that maybe I want it to go and detect that isn't in the group anymore to go and remove them from Active Directory. But here I could just go and select some users, up to 5, and that's going to trigger a provision on demand. So if I can't wait for that normal 20-minute cycle, for example, I could do the provision on demand to make it go and fire those off right now. And it will show me exactly what it was doing. So it was skipped because they're already there. There's nothing they need to change for those. So that was healthy. It's all good. But again, I could check the provisioning logs to see if there's any changes made around there. And also I can check the audit logs. So the audit logs will go and show me the various tasks that are being performed in the environment. So if there's any problems, if there's errors, I would go and see that as part of the audit logs. The other nice thing, we do have insights. Now, to use the insights, I have to have the diagnostic settings to be sending the provisioning logs to a log analytics workspace. But here I can actually see the details of everything we're doing. So I can see we're going from Entra to Active Directory. And here it's showing me, well, there's 2 groups being synchronized, a total of 6 users. And I can see the various other types, the creates, the updates. I can see details of success rates. If there's any failures, failures are probably the objects not found for that Dick Grayson character. But it gives me a nice view of everything that's happening in the environment. So it's just a nice place to go and see everything there. And I wonder if we go and look if we have our new group yet. So we do. So there's our fastest people got created. And if I double click fastest people, it's Barry Allen and Clark Kent, which sounds about right and matches what we had in the group in Entra. And again, if I change the membership, if I remove people, if I added people, it would typically show up in about 20 minutes unless I wanted to go and do that provisioning on demand. And then, hey, I'm forcing that to happen in near real time to go and get those updates. Licensing requirements. It's in preview right now, so I don't know what the final licensing will be. Today, all I need is my tenant to be at P1 level, which means I have at least 1 license of the Entra ID P1. The final licensing, I don't know that today. But once it GAs, then they'll tell you the full licensing for that. But that was really it. I hope this makes sense. I mean, fundamentally, what it's letting me do is leverage the Entra governance capabilities to manage the group memberships for things in Active Directory. So now all of those AD trusting resources can now take advantage of those Entra capabilities to maintain the memberships of those groups, like entitlement management, hate my access reviews, and everything else. Yes, I need Entra Cloud Sync and that provisioning agent, but that doesn't mean I can't still go and use the regular Entra Connect to replicate the objects. I can write those groups back to any OU I want. It doesn't have to be whatever the scoping of Cloud Sync is from AD to Entra. And once again, we get those nice logs for everything that's happening in the environment. It will show me the provisioning logs, as we saw, to show me the actual actions it's performing. And again, they're delayed by a few minutes, but now you can see, like the fastest people one is now showing up as the create and then the update. And then the audit logs show me the actual set of actions that it's done as part of all those items, the jobs it's running and success or failures. Insights, if I enable it, all I have to do for that part is to just make sure you've set up your diagnostic settings within the monitoring and health, and then your diagnostic settings. Just make sure you've got provisioning logs going to a log analytics workspace, and then we'll get that nice view of the insights, just to summarize everything that is going on. So obviously that means you are paying for log analytics workspace. You don't have to do that. Provisioning logs and audit logs are free and are always there. But if you want that slightly nicer view, then hey, you need to send it to a log analytics workspace and pay for those ingestion and potentially data retention charges. That was it. As always, I hope that was useful. Until next video, take care.